Without further ado, may I pass the floor over to our fantastic guest speaker. It's safe to say that Alastair needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. Alastair has been a phenomenon in British politics for many years in many different ways, but particularly on this issue and the importance of keeping the flame alive of the value of cooperation with our neighbours in Europe, especially in an uncertain world. Alastair is second to none in making the case for it. Alastair, over to you.
Well, thank you, Stella. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for having me. Thanks for being so efficient. And I've got to tell you, this is a big first for me because I've been thinking about what Labour should do next on Europe. And I'm going to begin by quoting a Tory favourably. And this is not just any old Tory, but this is the architect of austerity. This is the man who managed to persuade people that Gordon Brown caused the global financial crash when in truth Gordon did more than anyone to sort it. This is the man who failed to persuade Cameron not to call the referendum. And it was also the man who was the author of the Project Fear campaign, which failed with disastrous consequences, leaving us weaker, poorer, less powerful in the world, and much of our politics in a state of delusion and denialism. Yes, I'm talking about George Osborne. So I want to quote something that George Osborne said very, very recently. Here we go. There is such an easy trap here for the Labour government to set for the Conservatives, with the immediate economic benefit of doing something that's going to help your GDP in the next few years. Do some kind of trade deal with the EU of the kind that's talked about. Make it easier to do agricultural checks so we're not spending billions at the border doing that. You're basically digging a pit, you're putting the spikes in, and you're inviting Kemi Badenoch to walk into the pit. Because once the deal is done, every British business will start to adjust to the new trading relationship that they have with the EU, new customs arrangements, which will be an improvement. Then you get to the election and the Conservatives will say it's outrageous. They betrayed Brexit. They've conceded some power to the European Court of Justice. They'll try and rerun the Brexit campaign from 2016, which by then will be ancient history. And every business will just go, we're not going back to that. We're absolutely not going back into the Brexit chaos. And the Labour Party will win over the business community in that single manoeuvre, and the Tories will be stranded on a kind of ideological argument that only has resonance with a small portion of the population. Now, Osborne got an awful lot wrong in his time as Chancellor, but here he is, 2025, in my view, getting something right. Now, that Labour needs to win over the business community, or perhaps I should say re-win over the business community, is not in doubt. I did an event last week, 300 people, business people, and I asked them on a show of hands whether the Labour government was A, performing as expected, B, better than expected, or C, worse than expected. And when I spoke to this kind of audience before the election, many people in business, often including lifelong Tories, weren't just resigned to a change of government, they were relishing it. And so as a Labour supporter, I was really disappointed that my exercise last week had 0 hands raised for better than expected, around 20% as expected, but an overwhelming majority, more than 3/4, worse than expected. And when we got into the reasons, yes, there were things that you might expect to annoy business, the rise in national insurance, action on non-DOMs, which some of them don't like, VAT on school fees, workers' rights. And I could point out that at least the last 3 of these were promised in the manifesto. But another one that kept coming up was disappointment on the much vaunted reset with Europe. Now, many of you may know I'm absolutely obsessed with sport, not just for entertainment reasons, but because of what you can learn from it, about leadership, about teamship, about strategy, about communication. I collect great quotes from great sports people, like this one from the Canadian Wayne Gretzky, probably the world's best ever ice hockey player, who explained his greatness in this way: I skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it has been. And it strikes me that the reason why Labour might fail to recognise that Osborne is right is not just because he's George Osborne, but because the debate itself is largely stuck where the puck has been for almost a decade now. Will of the people, Brexit means Brexit, don't reopen old divisions, let's not scratch the scab for fear we do more damage. But the puck has moved. And it's now moving faster, in my view, than it was in 2016. And it's also moving faster than it was last year when Labour were elected on a mandate for change. There have been several factors which have moved it. Let's start with a few economic facts. And let's never stop reminding people of them. Never stop challenging our largely tamed and timid post-Brexit media to start covering them. Because name me any other event, any other crisis, any other set of circumstances which take between 4 and 5% out of our economy, and yet which lead to a weird national shrugging of the shoulders or a near parliamentary and media blackout on the real life consequences. So a few facts with thanks to The Independent for a great front page on the 5th anniversary of Brexit last month. The divorce settlement, 30 billion. The long-term hit on trade as assessed by the Office of Budget Responsibility, 15%. 27 billion drop in exports attributed to the new trade barriers. 118,000 tonnes fall in seafood exports. 16,400 businesses, some of whom may well have bought the idea that Brexit would mean less red tape, not more, but which have just given up on exporting to the EU because of the bureaucracy and the general buggeration. 56% of dairy producers struggling to find staff. 1.2 million EU nationals who've left us, and, remembering Take Back Control, the 2.3 million net migration into the UK since EU free movement ended. India, Bangladesh, Nigeria, how their people have benefited from the catastrophic act of self-harm and the Brexit deal that only Johnson and the ludicrous Frost are left defending. There are plenty more facts. Everyone on this call should know them, memorise them, never tire of using them. Subscribe to the New European if you want to keep abreast of them, or learn German and listen to the latest episode of my favourite German podcast, 8 Milliarden, which has just done an analysis of Brexit 5 years on, with the kind of stories you so rarely hear on UK media, of small businesses overwhelmed by the paperwork, of food exports stuck in customs so long they end up having to be destroyed, of businesses losing their business, not just in the EU, but in Northern Ireland as well. Then there's geopolitics. Remember the promises of the great new trade deals, not least with the US? A fantasy when it was promised, and an even bigger fantasy now, with an unreliable, unpredictable, anti-European, America first, and this time I really mean it, Donald Trump back in the White House. I can see why, given his tariff fixation, some in the government might want to wait to see whether he goes for the EU now, and we can somehow carve ourselves out some kind of exemption. But I think we need to stop kidding ourselves that because his mum was Scottish and he liked the Queen, we're likely to be spared the whims, the excesses, the infantile narcissism and the toxic nationalism. If ever we were to be confronted with the dangerous falsity of the choice that the right wing want to present, Europe or America, take your pick, I think the last 24 hours alone should shake us out of that nonsense. Yesterday was a day of triumph for Putin. No return to Ukraine's 2014 borders, says the Fox News Defence Secretary. No hope of Ukraine joining NATO. Zelensky and Europe seemingly cut out from a cosy Trump-Putin deal made in Saudi Arabia. When it comes to defence, Europe has got to get real. And Europe knows that means closer relations with the UK, and we need to know that too. There may have been a time, given the pain barrier that EU leaders went through with Brexit, when the door on any proper, meaningful reset for the UK would have been very hard to push open, but not anymore. Then there are those who will argue, why do we want to get closer again, given Labour at least won a big majority, whereas in Europe, it's the hard right, it's the pro-Putin populists who appear to be on the rise. The AfD in Germany, Marine Le Pen could be the next president of France. Viktor Orban, perhaps the most influential leader of a country of fewer than 10 million we have ever known. Austria, Slovakia, Italy, the Netherlands. But then think of it another way. Imagine the leadership that a UK government could and should be playing when seeking to work with others to meet the enormous challenges of our times. Because the puck has moved for Europe too, because the US, China and Russia are no longer where they were in 2016. Europe wants us more involved than they did, but they need to see more what the reset is meant to mean. Now, Labour can be justified in saying there can be no return to the customs union, the single market, freedom of movement, because that was the basis on which they were elected. I might say, and indeed I did say many, many times, they didn't need to go that far, but they did. So I cannot dispute that was how they won the election. But even with those red lines in place, with Osborne's suggestion in mind, take a look at the report commissioned by Best for Britain, who asked Frontier Economics to analyse the impact of a better deal with the EU on the EU economy, on the UK economy, staying within the red lines, but striving for closer alignment on goods and services. And the answer was a boost to our GDP somewhere between a low of 1.7% and a high of 2.2%. That would claw back up to half of the Brexit hit to our GDP. They assessed the gain to the UK economy of around 32 billion plus and to the EU 29.7. They also say Yorkshire and the Midlands are the regions which would fare best from the alignment that they suggest. That's Yorkshire and the Midlands, full of those so-called red wall seats, where, to believe the press and far too many of our politicians, there's a homogenised population sitting there warning that any tampering with this wonderful Johnson Frost deal would see them taking to the streets. It's nonsense. Make Brexit work is never going to work as a slogan, let alone as a strategy. Fix the bloody Brexit mess has a chance. Now, this weekend, Mark Carney, ex-governor of the Bank of England, now a Canadian Prime Minister you'll hope for, he's coming on the Rest is Politics podcast. And so as part of the research, I've been looking at some old interviews with him. In one of them, he explains why Project Fear turned out to be, if anything, an underestimate. During the Brexit means Brexit phase, when we hadn't actually left, supporters of Brexit could claim that the worst predictions didn't materialise. But the fall in the value of sterling was a signal, and he said that since we left, whether you look at growth, productivity, investment, trade deals, quote, the warnings have proven to be directionally right. To all but the most ardent supporter of Brexit, that much is now clear. The Frontier Economics report was, of course, not considered newsworthy by most of our media, partly because to admit Brexit was a disaster would require them to admit their role in the battle that led to Cameron calling the referendum and losing it. But the more they and the populists they support try to hide the truth about Brexit, the more we need to tell it and keep telling it. Because here's the biggest puck mover of all. Public opinion has moved substantially. And the public, in my view, are well ahead of the politicians. Even with the continuing media bias, the easy ride that's given to Brexit's main perpetrators, continual nonsensical bleating by Tories and reformers that Labour are trying to reverse Brexit by stealth, if only, because of the facts, because of the reality that people see in their own lives, public opinion has shifted and keeps shifting. It's why Nigel Farage barely talks about it, having moved on to either pretending to be a farmer or running in absentia the Clacton branch of the Donald Trump fan club. And here is my final point about what Labour should do now. Stop debating Brexit on your opponent's terms. Stop being so defensive about spelling out the facts, the scale of the disaster that the Brexit deal inflicted upon us. Stop treating Nigel Farage like some exotic celebrity who managed to play the media like a fiddle and start treating him for what he is. A man who thinks he can become Prime Minister, but knows it can only happen if his ideas and his policies, insofar as he has them, are spared the kind of scrutiny that usually happens to anyone who wants to be Prime Minister. Treat him like a politician. Take apart his arguments, expose his record, show that beneath the bonhomie and the bluster is an agenda that would take this country in a dark and dangerous direction. The German podcast I mentioned was titled The Crazy Comeback of Nigel Farage. They quoted the promises he made for Brexit, the promises to leave the country if it failed, alongside his admission it has failed, although obviously not his fault. The presenter couldn't understand why Farage was not politically finished, given his role in something even he said was a failure. Der Spiegel's London correspondent essentially said it was an expression of the weakness of his opponents rather than any exceptional strengths of his. So how on earth are we allowed Farage, along with Johnson, the prime mover and the prime driver of Brexit, to reinvent himself so that he can flip from studio to studio, and the B word and his role within it barely gets mentioned? And when it does, he really doesn't like it. I saw that for myself when I was on BBC Question Time with him a few weeks ago. He seems to want to talk about anything but Brexit. Brexit is all that he should be allowed to talk about. It's the one thing he has achieved, and it's done real damage to the country of which he claims to be patriot in chief. The man who gave us Brexit and the economic hit I've outlined, now telling us he's the man to get our economy on its feet. Poses as a man of the people, yet is down on his knees begging for millions from the richest man in the world, currently punishing the poorest in the world, who claims to be for the little people, but wants to demolish the welfare and health systems on which so many depend, who, having done damage to the UK via Brexit, now wants to damage the whole planet by becoming the UK voice for the billionaire climate change deniers across the Atlantic. He is not a cheeky chappy. He is a very bad man, but a clever man, well funded, well plugged into the international hard right campaign that is, let's admit it, on the march, and with Trump in power, feeling there is nothing they cannot do, nothing they cannot get away with. So we, all of us, have to do a better job of mirroring the internationalization of their campaigns, of learning from how they do it, as well as exposing how they do it. Not stooping to their level, but recognizing that the media landscape has changed out of recognition, realizing that this changes the nature of campaigns and communication, and indeed the way that politics is done. The optimist in me says the populist right will come a cropper. The realist in me says we should not take that for granted, nor should we underestimate the damage they've done, the damage they're doing now, and can do well into the future. They will only be stopped if we stop them. And to do that in the UK, the US, in Europe and around the world, we have to do a better job than we've done thus far. But let me end on a note of optimism. If public opinion as moved as it has on Brexit, even with a hugely biased media, the Brexit blackout, politicians continuing to lie about what they promised and the effect of what they actually did, and with so much else happening in the world, imagine how much faster it could move if we really got our act together, saw where the puck was heading, and put together the campaign to get there ahead of it. Mandela, everything is impossible until you make it happen. That was the mindset that drove the Brexit campaigners, and they won. That's the mindset we have to have now. Labour's position needs to change because the country's position needs to change. It can and it must. We cannot keep pretending that the damage is anything but real and deep, but nor can we ever stop believing that something can be done to fix it.
Thank you, Alastair. Thank you for that tour de force, which I will be carefully rebranding on our website as Fix the Puck Up. I think that is a...
Fix the puck up. No, no. Go to where the puck is heading.
I'm now going to invite our members, if they have questions to ask you. I'll take them in groups of 3,
Okay.
and we will gender balance the questions. So if that's an encouragement that is required to ensure that all voices can be heard within the Labour Movement for Europe, I will ask Mariana to unmute the people who are asking a question. I'm going to
There was me thinking DEI was all over.
Oh, we only deal in facts and the evidence of what actually makes a difference.
I know you do.
Fiction in Mr. Musk's mind. Right, so as I say, I will take them gender balanced. And I will not say that phrase more quickly to the person in the comments because my mother is listening into this. Right, I'm going to start with Peter Inman, if you can, we can unmute Peter, and I will encourage to say gender balance. So the women in the audience, please know that you are very welcome to ask a question. But Peter, if we'll start with you, please.
Hello. Good evening, everyone. Hi, Alastair.
Hi.
Thanks for the point that you made. My question really is about the reality of being in government, really, and my question is, if you were running Labour's communication strategy now, how would you frame the arguments in terms of a media campaign? Because at the moment we're living in the sort of real world where the government's position is having to make technical policy like regulatory alignment seem uh, sexy to people, and I don't think it really is.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. Philippe, next, please.
Hello there. Hi, Alastair. Hi, Stella. I'm Ariana. Actually, a bit of a follow-on from that, and that was sort of, if Alastair, if you concede that the media's quite a bit more vicious than your time in government, and with the superpowering that apps like TikTok, although it might be on the way out, are fueling those sort of Eurosceptic and far-right devices. How would you try and tackle some of the viciousness behind it that really just love this kind of aggressive Euroscepticism, will continue to feed it in years to come? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks, Philippe. And Jackie, please. You should be able to
Good evening. Yes, I am unmuted. Thank you. This is from a Welsh perspective. So what advice would you give, whether it's the Welsh government or the people of Wales, when you've got the rise of reform coming here and coming for us? Thank you.
Fantastic.
Right. Well, thanks for it. I guess, right, if I was in government, if I was working with the government advising it, I think I'd go back to some of the things that I said in my opening remarks. Be much bolder about what it is you're trying to achieve. I would argue that one of the reasons that the government's got itself into, not a great position on the economy, which I alluded to with the survey I did of those business guys, is the sort of the gap that there was between the election and the budget, and the sense of kind of a bit of a vacuum that developed and other stuff came in and filled it. And likewise on Europe, when you talk about a reset, yes, the negotiations, this relates to Philippe's questions again, the negotiations often will be about technical issues, which people really don't want to think about that much. They want the government to get on and do it. But what they need to know is that there's a process and there's a vision, and that you're trying to get the country to a better place. And when I talk about the puck, the debate being where the puck was rather than where it's going, I think if you still believe either that Brexit is popular, or that people think that what they were promised is happening, or that you think that the relations that have been damaged are being properly repaired, then that's not where the public is. Where the public is, look, we had that debate. It was almost a decade ago now. We've kind of by and large accepted it's not going very well. We look to the government to fix it. So that's why I say, if you say make Brexit work, which is the current communications frame, then you're essentially saying it can work and it can work well. And deep in their hearts, they don't believe that. Deep in their hearts, what they believe is it's been a bit of a disaster, but we've got to pretend. And the public, they see through that. So the framing for me has got to be, wish it hadn't happened. You can keep your red lines, but within those red lines, we are going to seek to repair the damage that's been done. And then that can take you into all sorts of areas which don't necessarily need to kind of fill the debates in Parliament, fill the pages of the media. And the point about the viciousness of the media, Philippe, the right-wing media has always largely felt that Labour governments are illegitimate. They shouldn't exist. It's always been the case. Yes, at times in recent months it's maybe been harder, but it's no harder than Neil Kinnock had to deal with. It's no harder than we had towards the end of Tony Blair's time. You've just got to deal with that. And the way to deal with it is to have your own strategy and your own messaging, which is more stronger, clearer, and more powerful than that that's being thrown at you. And if you worry too much about the stuff that's going to be thrown at you, that's when you get into the defensive mindset. And once you're into the defensive mindset, you can't do the things that deep in your heart you should be doing. Wales is really interesting to me because, the rest of the country, I think sometimes think, oh, Wales is just going to be Labour forever. But the fact is, as you say, Jackie, reform has been, you know, a little bit too much on the rise there. And I would go back to what I said earlier. We allow reform. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I watched earlier an interview that Julia Hartley-Brewer did with, and Julia Hartley-Brewer is, you know, one of the kind of right out there sort of pro-Brexit commentators, but she was doing an interview with Richard Tice about Ukraine, and she absolutely destroyed him. Because where she's coming from, she's kind of pro-Zelensky, anti-Putin, and he was doing his mealy mouth, you know, let's have a negotiation, let's all hold hands and sing Kumbaya and it will be over. And I just think we're not aggressive enough with reform. We treat them like a kind of, they're over there, they'll make their noise, they're like a sort of nasty dog in the corner and just leave them. No, they're a real threat. Treat them like a real threat. Advertise to the public who they are, what they're trying to do. Because there's no, and listen, don't underestimate them either. Nigel Farage is a very, very skillful, very skilled politician and communicator. Turn those strengths into a weakness. Skilled professional politicians and communicators ought to have policies that are coherent, ought to be able to explain how they would actually run a country, not just what's wrong with the way the country is run. But you have to have a strategy for that. And I think Wales, actually, with the elections coming up, I don't know the extent to, because I've not been in Wales recently that much, but I don't know the extent to which Welsh Labour are sort of going after reform. But last time I was there, I was kind of hearing, well, we don't want to sort of ventilate them. We don't want to give them attention they maybe wouldn't get. They know how to get attention. So go after them, I say, much harder than has been done this far.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alastair. I'm going to take another round of questions and a reminder that we gender balance our questions in the LME. I'll start with Dave, please. Dave Levy, if we can unmark.
Thank you, Stella. How do we confront reform on Brexit and the EU if we're not willing to actually confront them on their racism within the immigration policy? And why can a government change its mind on manifesto promises on welfare and it can't change its mind on the EU? As Keynes said, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do?
Thank you, Dave.
Sorry, yeah.
Cheeky of getting in two questions, but I'll allow it because you're quick. Linda, please. Linda Gilroy. Are you able to unmute yourself, Linda?
Hello, can you hear
There
me?
we are. Yes.
Right, okay. Speaking from Scotland at the moment, Alastair, rather than from Plymouth, there are Scottish elections next year. How can Keir Starmer help Anas Sarwar to win that election by changing the way he's stating our European policies?
Okay.
And then Ben, please. Ben Hartley.
Thank you, Stella. Thank you, Alastair. Really, really interesting. I guess my question is probably a nice follow-up to what David asked, I think, which is and what you said in answer to the last round of questions. I think in taking on reform, it's a real challenge, and I wondered if you could say a little bit more about how we address that, because I think during the Brexit referendum, we Remain campaigners were talking a lot in facts and figures, how much better off the average household is, all those sorts of figures. But the Leave campaign, I think, was successful because it appealed to a real emotional feeling amongst people, all these ideas of control and sovereignty. And so how do we tackle that? My fear is as soon as we start to talk about moving towards a customs union, single market, close relationship, the reform populist message will just be, oh, look, Labour are ceding control to Europe again. So how do we tackle that in the face of what reform will say, particularly given Labour seem very scared of reform at the moment, and reform are likely to be funded so to be able to pump out lots of social media content when that time comes? Thank you.
Well, one of the things I'll start with that, Ben. One of the things I was kind of alluding to when I talked about learning from the way the populist right operate, as well as exposing it, the truth is, I mentioned the thing I was on with Question Time, and I had a couple of hours with Nigel Farage in the green room because we both got there quite early and were chatting away. And the thing you have to understand about Nigel Farage, he's absolutely obsessed with media, obsessed. He's the only person I know who still reads every national newspaper every day. One of his proudest achievements is that he's got over 1 million followers on TikTok. Now, you have to compete with that. I don't think anybody should read all the newspapers, because I think it's, by and large, a waste of time. But I think understanding media trends is a very, very important part of modern politics. And I worry that a lot of our politics and a lot of our language is still trapped in a politics of the near past. And interestingly, I thought it was interesting that the cabinet the other day, Keir Starmer apparently said that, the battle in politics these days is between the disruptor and the disrupted. And right now, the disruptors win. You have to disrupt. And that's why I say that I think Labour needs to be bolder. At the moment, if you look at the fights that Labour are having, they're about things that you wouldn't necessarily expect in a Labour government to want to have fights about. One of you just mentioned in relation to welfare, or it might be the fight about Heathrow, it might be the fight about winter fuel, it might be the fight with farmers on inheritance tax. So pick fights, have fights on big things that matter, and where you feel there is a big argument to be won. So I feel that, and this relates maybe to Scotland. The question Linda asked was, how can Keir help Anas? In a way, Anas, who I've got a lot of time for Anas, I think he's a very charismatic guy, I think he's smart. But the fact is that, Scottish, Welsh parties, local parties in local and regional elections, there will always be a sense of the national party impacting upon how you communicate, how you're seen, and so forth. And I would say that the kind of change in messaging that I'm calling for, I think Scottish and Welsh elections would be very, very open to those kind of arguments. And the point about changing your mind, it is hard. There's no doubt it is hard. If you've been very, very clear about certain things that you're going to do or not going to do, you will pay a price if you go against them. The question you've got to decide is whether that price is ever worth paying. What George Osborne was setting out essentially was a form of customs union. That's essentially what he was saying. But, clever people can quite easily put together an agreement with the European Union that takes away some of these barriers that have done so much damage to our trading. And you can frankly call it whatever you want. It doesn't ultimately matter. And I think where Osborne is absolutely right, once something that people can see as a change for the better is implemented, the puck has moved. So the Tories get left behind with arguments that are now redundant. The reason why I still feel so strongly, this goes to Ben's point, the reason why I feel so strongly that the facts do matter is because, yes, emotion is always important in politics. But back when it was Project Lies against Project Fear in 2016, nobody knew. Nobody knew. I could argue, Cameron could argue that it was not going to be a good thing, okay? They could say it was. Johnson, Gove, Farage, they could say it was going to be great. Now we at least have a very considerable body of empirical evidence that says this has not gone very well for this country. And I think one of the reasons why I feel so strongly that Labour made a strategic error, essentially in vacating the field on Brexit, when the kind of bad news started to come through, is that the pinning of it on those who caused it has not been clear. And that's why Farage is able to suddenly become Mr. Anti-Net Zero, or Mr. Never mind Brexit, I'll just focus on immigration, or the guy who goes after the Tories on the right to get money and fundraising, all that. So it all speaks to what I've been saying through the speech that I made and through the comments I've made to the first round of questions. It's about having a much bolder, clearer strategy that wants to end up with greater alignment, because the government understands that is the best thing for Britain. And once you've made that strategic judgment, the communication actually becomes fairly straightforward.
Thank you, Alastair. I am going to try and fit in, hopefully, 2 more rounds of questions. So I do ask for brevity on all sides, just because I want to get, we can see there's lots of hands up. David Black, please.
Hello. Is it me or
David, it's you.
I want to say we should be stressing in the importance of defence and security policy.
Yeah.
Obviously, the support for Ukraine is important, but it's important this is an area where we can have good relations even with the EU, even with all the cramping restrictions that the government has put on Labour policy. But we defence and security is an area where we can and we should speak out loudly. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Mari, please. Mari Beacon.
Yeah. Hi, I have a friend who insists that the EU is a fundamentally right-wing institution that we should never rejoin because it would stop us doing like really popular things like railway nationalisation. I don't think he's right, but do you have any suggestions of how to win that argument?
You wouldn't call Jeremy, would he?
Life is too short for friends like that, Mari. And finally, if I can call George, please.
Hello. I wanted to ask about the youth mobility. If I may, 2 very short questions, but they're both relevant to that issue. First, how important, from your knowledge of Europe, the European political scene, how important do you think that issue is for the EU, and how wedded do you think EU governments are to the quite maximalist version of youth mobility scheme that the Commission's negotiating mandate seems to point towards? And second, as an expert in communications, how would you sell the idea of a youth mobility scheme to a population that is quite worried about immigration, and perhaps to a Home Office that is institutionally resistant to anything that involves immigration?
Okay, so first of all, I completely agree with David about Ukraine. That's why I spent a fair part of my opening remarks focused on that. I think the last 24 hours should just underline to all of us that, you know, the defence arrangements that we've maybe taken for granted, frankly, most of our lifetime, and I'm one of the oldest people here, can no longer be taken for granted. And where Trump has had a point in his first term, is that Europe, frankly, has taken American leadership in NATO and American defence of Europe for granted. And that, it seems to me, is a big point. European defence, Tony Blair tried to get it going with Chirac at certain points, never really happened. But I think the concept of a European defence and security policy is one where Europe needs Britain, and Europe desperately wants Britain to get involved. And I think as that relationship develops, and I thought it was good last night that the European leaders, including the UK, came out and said some pretty strong things about the importance of defending Ukraine's interests. So I completely agree with David on that. Mari, I think that is one of the reasons why perhaps Jeremy, when he was leading the Labour Party during the referendum, how can I put this politely, didn't really put his shoulder to the wheel in the way that maybe he might have done. There has been this view on the left that the European Union is quotes right wing. But in a way, I always felt about the Council of Europe, the European Union is a collection of the European democracies. And that's why it's so tragic that our leadership right now is not there. Because if you have a progressive left of centre British government, you have an awful lot of clout within the European Union. You can set the agenda for the European Union. So, you know, there are some people who will always see it in that way. They don't like the idea of any sort of international multilateral institution. But we sometimes look at these international bodies as though they're sitting above us. We are part of them. when we were in the European Union, we did follow other elections because it had an impact upon how we were able to operate, the sort of appointments we could make, the arguments we could make and win or lose. So I don't know how you win the argument against somebody who believes that, other than telling them that they're wrong. And they have to understand that ultimately the European Union is a collection of democracies. On the youth mobility, George, I don't know how wedded they are to it. I think they're confused as to why we don't see the obvious benefits of this. And when you talk about selling it, I think one of the biggest losses of Brexit is a young generation growing up. We talk about taking back control as though we've gained stuff. But actually, a young generation in particular, I think, has lost so much. And the sort of scheme that's being talked about is provide, and there will be rules, and you will have to, have periods you can stay. It may end up with people, getting married, settling, all that sort of stuff. But heaven's sake, that has happened through time without the need for international institutions to kind of police it. So I think they are wedded to it. I think they're right to be wedded to it. I think it's a very, very useful way of rebuilding a bridge that has been shattered by Brexit and that needs to be rebuilt. And on the Home Office, I mean, look, they've got enough on their plate to worry about the 2.3 million net migration that I talked about. This is hardly going to eat into it.
Right, I'm going to do a final round of questions. So I'm going to take double the number of speakers, but it does mean not everyone's going to get in. I'm really sorry. I could ask for brevity from people. I'm going to start with Miranda Grell, please.
Hi, so I'm trying to put my camera on. Thank you so much. Yeah, the question I have, Stella and Alastair, is there are people who are now regretters about voting for Brexit. What I've not heard in any of the debates when we talk about how we can persuade the party and the country to kind of become, rejoin and all of that is, how do we make it easy for people who are quiet regretters to kind of change their minds publicly without people laughing at them or saying, it's your fault? What I've not heard from comms experts is what we can do to let those people sort of come out, if that makes sense. What are your tips for that?
Yeah.
Any strategies?
Okay.
Fantastic question. I'm going to go to David Gow, please.
Yes. Hi. Sorry. After precisely what's happened this week, with a clearer, bolder strategy as regards defence and security for the UK, be a much closer relationship with Europe, and not only a much closer relationship with Europe, but a recognition that we can no longer rely on the Americans to defend us and Europe, and indeed NATO may have to come into question.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Brenda, please. Brenda Ashton.
Hi, Alastair. I agree with everything you said. I want our government to be more daring about this, as you said, and I'd like you to advise us on how we, as Labour activists and pro-Europeans, can put pressure, can influence the government. I mean, I think it's great that we have Labour Movement for Europe emotions. I'd like one every month. And the other question is, does Keir have the right advisors on the EU?
Right. Well, I don't know who his advisors specifically on the EU are, but ultimately, speaking as a former advisor to a prime minister, I've never believed it's about the advisors. Ultimately, it's about the leaders and the decision that what they want for the job that they're doing in the country that they lead and the decisions they make for that. Let me start with Miranda and regretters, because I'm going to give you you say what advice. I'm going to pass on the advice that a teenage girl gave me in Clacton when I was on that question time program, not the one with Farage. I don't know if you remember, there was a question time program when the entire audience were Leave voters. This was 2 or 3 years after the referendum. and I was probably the only Remainer in the building. And, you know, I think they'd gone far and wide to find somebody who would do it. So I went to this school on the way in one of the poorest parts of the country, and I did a little sort of session and a Q&A, and then I said at the end, right, I'm going off to see this. I'm going off to do this TV program. Everybody there is a leaver. How do you think I should handle it? And I said, for example, do you think I should sort of, you know, pretend to agree with them on certain things or say that they had a point or whatever? And this girl called Abigail, she said, no, don't do that. They won't respect you for that. You have to say what you think. You should, she said, you should try and persuade without judgment. And I've thought about that a lot since, because I think there's a real danger. We saw this in America in the election, where the Democrats so believe that Donald Trump is an abomination, that the Democrats had a decent record. They literally couldn't understand why anybody could vote for the other side. And I think there was a danger that we had that in the referendum as well. How can you possibly vote for that? And the fact is that you have to understand why people did vote. And one of the reasons they vote, this goes to the issue of trust in politics, is people still by and large will listen to politicians, do listen to politicians, particularly in campaigns, and were prepared to believe Johnson and Gove and Farage and Rees-Mogg and all the rest of them. So what I do with regretters is welcome them. And I actually said in that question time, I don't blame you for voting as you did, because you were given very good reasons to vote, because you were told it was going to improve the health service. It was going to lead to communities being stronger. It was going to blah, 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 blah. You were misled. And that's it. That's all you can do. And then try and turn them into activists. And sometimes you'd be surprised how many, when people are prepared to admit that they've been misled and they've been maybe scammed and stung, as it were, that they then will want to put something back to get right. David Gower, is that the David Gower, ex of The Guardian? That is a very, very, very big question. And I could see why probably any European leader right now would not necessarily, angry though they might be at what Trump has just done, agreeing with you possibly that America cannot be relied on in the way that we maybe thought. Two things I would say. One, Donald Trump's not going to be there forever. Hopefully the institution of NATO might be and should be. But what I think does have to happen is that European leaders have to deliver now on stronger coordinated defence policies than up to this point we've had, because we frankly have been too willing to rely on the Americans, and right now they don't appear to be very reliable. But I think, you know, it'd be very, very foolhardy of any Labour leader right now to come out and say what I've just said. I think that would be a mistake. And then the final point about pressure on Labour, well, there's only so many ways you can do it. But ultimately, I think it's about the strength of your argument and how you keep making those arguments. And it depends who and what you are. It's easier I'm in a very privileged position now. I'm not even a member of the Labour Party. I mean, I'm a big Labour supporter, but I've got a sense of freedom. It's harder for somebody like Stella. She's an MP. You know, she's been elected on a platform. It's harder. It's even harder for people who are on the front bench and completely bound by collective responsibility. But I think all of us who are not in those positions can do is keep building and making the arguments, and don't give up on it, and don't move away from it. It's so easy just to think, well, we didn't win, we lost the referendum, we didn't get what we wanted on the manifesto. Is there much point carrying on with this? And all I say to people is, well, Bill Cash didn't think like that. Jacob Rees-Mogg didn't think like that. Nigel Farage didn't think like that. They just kept going. So what I'd say is you just got to keep going. You've got to keep believing what you believe, fighting for it, arguing for it in whatever way you can.
Right, final three questions I'm going to squeeze in before we have to do our democratic bit. Liam, please. Liam You should be getting an Alastair unmute. There we go.
Hi, hello. Hi, Stella, and hi, Alastair. So I'm a student in Belgium at the moment, and one thing that I felt is that the trust that Europeans have in us is a lot less. And so I think we've started to make the argument and win the argument in Britain that we need to be more pro-European. However, what I want to ask Alastair is, how do we convince Europeans that Brexit was a tragedy for Europe as well?
Yep.
And then I'm clearly going to ask Anne Black as a member of the Labour NEC. Not least because we want to make sure our social societies keep supporting us. Anne.
Okay, in a personal capacity, obviously. Back to reform. The Welsh Senate elections are being conducted next year using a closed list system like the European elections did, which gave Nigel Farage his foothold in Europe. And maybe Plaid will also do very well. So are we going to end up in a position where it looks as if proportional representation is enabling reform to get more power and do all the damage that they do on Europe and everything else? And what should we do about it?
And then finally, Doris, you did say in the chat you wanted to ask a question, but you couldn't find the button. So I'm going to unmute you. Doris, if you want to ask the final question, because I promised you an opportunity to speak. There we go.
Thank you very much. One of the issues that worries me is the disaster after Brexit for farmers must be felt by hundreds of thousands of them. And yet all they're doing at the moment is protesting about the inheritance tax. What is your opinion of what is driving that, instead of them saying what is not being effective for them since leaving Europe?
Well, that is, if I may say so, a great question. And it goes back to what I was saying about how we have allowed Farage to move on. So there's Farage. Every time there's a farmers' protest, he's out there with his flat cap and his barber and his wellies, cosplaying being a kind of country gent and being on the side of the farmer. He's only going to get challenged, and they're only going to hear him get challenged if the arguments are put that we understand and we hear what you're saying about inheritance tax, but believe me, it is as nothing to the damage that Brexit has done. But for some reason, we're scared to make that argument. And, you know, any protest movement will get politicised. The recent one, the one that drove down Whitehall, there was Jeremy Clarkson on it. Jeremy Clarkson, who's there because he's now a farmer, TV farmer, and yet who last week wrote an absolutely excoriating column in the Sunday Times about the disaster of Brexit. So if even he can't make that link because nobody's making it for him, it's not part of the conversation that we as a country and as a body politic are happening, then don't be surprised that opportunists can jump upon any bandwagon. So we have got to keep making the argument about the damage done. And, you know, that's what I find so frustrating about this. When you see, and the farmers themselves, I mean, I come from farming stock. My mum was a farmer's daughter. My dad was a crofter's son. And, you know, you've got to challenge people. Well, I'm sorry about this, but how did you vote in the referendum? You know, this isn't, you don't just see one thing in isolation because it's suddenly become a campaign. Belgium, Liam in Belgium. Look, I don't think it's about persuading the Europeans that Brexit's been a tragedy for them. I'm amazed how when I speak, maybe it's mainly politicians, when I'm speaking to politicians, I think they accept that it's been bad for them. You know, I read Angela Merkel's biography recently, and she was very, very clear that she felt Brexit was a shameful event, she called it, for the European Union, because she saw it as a failure of the European Union. So I don't think we have to persuade them. I think what we have to persuade them is that we're serious about trying to rebuild the relations and that our politics is serious, so that we're not just going to be going backwards and forwards like a yo-yo, dependent upon, you know, each election and the outcome of it. So maybe you're there, you're living in Belgium, so you probably speak to far more people than I do. But, you know, Rory Stewart and I were talking last week to the Prime Minister of Denmark, and she was saying the same. You know, Denmark's one of the more Eurosceptic European countries, but she was saying, and every time I speak to somebody from Portugal, from Ireland, from some of the smaller European countries, they're devastated that Britain's not there, because we were often their voice in the really big battles between the kind of, you know, the big powers in the European Union. Reform in Wales and PR. I mean, and that is why I blow hot and cold about PR the whole time. I mean, people think that PR is like a sort of panacea and that's the way to fix our politics and so forth. And sometimes I believe that. But you're right. I mean, PR is what gave Farage the platform he got in the European Parliament, which he exploited very, very well. He's finally made it under first past the post. Plaid and Reform probably will do better because of the system. But, you know, again, it's our political system that creates the political systems within our political system. So unless we, you know, we have to be honest about that. We it's like when we did the Scottish Parliament, you know, we deliberately devised a system so that no one party could ever have absolute power. Why? Because at the time we were so powerful in Scotland. Within half a generation, the SNP's got complete control of the damn thing. Nobody planned that. So we can't really complain if a system that we've devised is used by a political opponent. Far more important, you've got to beat them on the arguments. And that's where I think we've been very weak in the last decade or so.
Thank you, Alastair. And thank you so much to everybody for brilliant, really good questions. I hope people have enjoyed this section of our AGM. I would ask you to give Alastair a virtual round of applause, however you choose to do it, using the various React functions that we have on Zoom. But at this point, I am going to draw Alastair to a close, mainly because I want to make sure we do have time for some of the meaty, perhaps less exciting and less involving saying the word puck, hopefully, as this session's been. But thank you so much, Alastair, for coming and addressing the meeting this evening and firing us all up.
All the best.
And of course, everybody should be reading Alastair's columns in the New European and listening.
Of course they should.
If you're not already. I'll plug your gear even if you don't. So that's